You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. If ever there was a chapter that showcased how deeply complex and even difficult to understand the book of Ecclesiastes can be, this would be it. Qoheleth starts off the chapter presenting a very fascinating and sometimes even frustrating blend of tradition and unorthodoxy as he reflects on religious practices he sees around him. He urges humility in approaching God, but he also challenges conventional wisdom by advocating for, get this, less frequent prayer, by asserting that God is in heaven and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. And then he proceeds to challenge popular wisdom about the value of money and saving for retirement. This is going to be quite the chapter. This is Ecclesiastes 5, Uncut and Unfiltered. We left off last week, and I mentioned that the first verse of this chapter that we have in English, our chapter 5, verse 1, is actually the last verse of chapter 4 in Hebrew. So in nearly every English Bible, chapter 4 of Ecclesiastes is going to have 16 verses. However, in Hebrew, it has 17. And that's not like a missing verse or a different verse or anything like that. It's just a different way of numbering the verses. It's important to realize that these works, really all of the books, quote unquote, of the Bible, they weren't originally books. They were scrolls, they were letters, they were written down on whatever was available sometimes. It wasn't as clean cut as writing is today. It's not like these people just pulled up a computer and a word processor and started typing. So the chapter and verse divisions that we're familiar with are actually very recent additions to the biblical text. As these works began to be studied more over time, scribes would break apart paragraphs of the text. And then really it's only roughly 1,000-ish years ago that we started having anything even close to what our chapter divisions are today. And then the verses came about another 500 years later. So Bibles haven't even had verses for basically 500 years. So what seems just such a given to us was not there for the majority of the time these texts have been around. So that's important to remember because I know people who really take their Bible seriously and appreciate its wisdom and authority in their lives can feel frazzled when they're presented with this sort of thing. Because this isn't usually what you hear in church. You just assume if I pick up my Bible, it's going to be exactly what is there in the text. And that's usually the case. I mean, our English versions are reliable translations. I don't ever want to take that away from someone. But I think this is important to realize that these texts existed before their English versions that we're used to today. So this doesn't change the meaning of anything. It just shows that the Hebrew scribes who had this well before us thought that the chapter should end one verse later, and the English translators decided to move it one verse back. I almost always end up agreeing with the Hebrew version when there's a difference between Hebrew and English breaking up of a chapter or a verse or what have you. But this is a rare case where I'd say the English break makes a lot more sense to me, because this verse, our English verse 1 of chapter 5, fits better with the following context than with the preceding context. So that's why, even though this is the end of chapter 4 in the Hebrew Bible, we decided to address it here today. So let's look at these first few verses because there is a lot that is going on in here. It reads, "Keep your foot when you go to the house of God, and be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools, because they don't consider that they do evil. Don't be rash with your mouth, and don't let your heart be hasty to utter anything before God, because God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. As a dream comes through the multitude of busyness, and a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words. When you vow a vow to God, don't hesitate to pay it, because he has no delight in fools. Pay that which you have vowed. It's better that you shouldn't vow at all than that you should vow and not pay. Don't allow your mouth to cause your flesh to sin. Don't say before the angel that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your voice and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words, there are also vanities, hevels. But you should fear God. We're going to stop there. That gives us quite a bit to work through here. Keep your foot when you go into the house of God. Keep means to watch over, to protect, to be careful with. So it's saying, watch your step. The King James says, keep your foot. Technically, it's feet, plural. And I think pretty much every other English version I could find corrected that. Doesn't really make a difference, but just a note I wanted to add there. Now, notice that this is an imperative statement. It is a command that Qoheleth is speaking directly to the audience. That's pretty rare. He usually speaks to a third person, not directly to the audience. So some think that this could actually have been added in later, and that would be convenient because what he says here doesn't exactly seem to fit in either the form, the context, or the beliefs that he shares throughout the rest of the book. It's almost a little too orthodox. But I think we can make sense of it if we remember that Qoheleth does not have in mind the picture of God that many Christians do, where it's supposed to be a loving, fatherly God that wants to have a relationship with you. He is dealing with a capricious God who controls the fate of your life according to his whims and whether or not you please him. I'm not saying we have to agree with his beliefs about God. I personally do not like viewing God that way at all. But in order to understand what he is presenting, it helps for us to keep that view in mind. Christopher Wright, in Hearing the Message of Ecclesiastes, points out that watch your steps could mean to examine your life before you go into the temple. In other words, going to church is not enough. You have to consider what is more important than your religious acts of devotion. It's actually your life. No matter how much time you spend within a religious building or group, you still spend the majority of your time outside of that. So this is kind of similar to when Jesus said to leave your gift before the altar if you realize that you have an offense between you and someone else. In other words, what matters most is your actual life, not your church life, not the religious stuff in your life, but your everyday life. Anyone can put on a good face for a couple hours on a Sunday and maybe a midweek service, but what really matters is how you live the rest of the week. That being said, I want to take a second and address his term, the house of God, because when Christians hear that, they just tend to think church, because a lot of times a church is called the house of God. But that is most likely referring to the temple. Some have suggested that if this book was written post-exile, after the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians, that maybe it could be referring to local synagogues that cropped up in the time in between. But I couldn't find anything where Jews referred to synagogues as houses of God. I have not been able to find any verification of that. The temple does get called that, but it doesn't seem like synagogues did. So I think this is just referencing the temple. I think we have to be careful transporting our idea of a modern church onto the ancient Israelite temple because there are a lot of differences in the way those two things work, but it's natural to try to find a comparison because that's just the closest thing we have. But it's worth realizing they are separate entities. The church is not a one-for-one correspondence to the old temple. That is, he has more in mind a temple here and not necessarily a church as we would think of it. We start getting into some interpretive difficulties here, as Qoheleth says to be careful when entering the temple and to be more ready to hear than to give a sacrifice of fools. And really this is going to come down to how you view the book as a whole. Are you trying to force a positive perspective out of the book? Are you assuming a nihilistic, depressed, negative view in the book? Or are you trying to find something in between like we're trying to do here? The New International Commentary on the Old Testament, which I have referenced several times now in this series, Uncut, it gets at the heart of this pretty well. It says, Qoheleth's tone in this section is hard to determine. It's clear that he does not wholeheartedly affirm or encourage the cult. Now, let me pause for a second here and say that when Bible scholars talk about a cult, they are not referring to the way that we use it in modern parlance today. They're not talking about a small group of people following a charismatic leader and drinking Kool-Aid. Cult in a Bible scholar sense means a religious system. So you might hear someone talk about the Israelite temple cult. That is not saying that they formed a circle in the temple and started chanting and doing weird things. It means the religious practices surrounding the temple. So if you ever come across that in this sort of context, that's what it means. He's going to use it here a couple times, so I just wanted to make sure we clarified that. Nothing weird that he's talking about, and I know that can sound so strange because a cult is such a bad thing, and we're talking about Israelite religious practices, which we assume are good things, but it's called a cult, so just get the bad connotation out of your mind here today. I don't think I'm going to be using cult in the normal sense at any point in this episode, just in this particular meaning here. See how we can do with that. So Qoheleth's tone is difficult to determine. It's clear he does not wholeheartedly affirm or encourage the cult, but he does not abandon it either. So how is one to understand his statement, God is in heaven and you are on earth? Is this piety or an expression of God's disinterest? Can you see those two options there? Read it in two different lights. God is in heaven and you are in earth. So you could see that as piety, saying, well, we should just trust God. He's the one up there, kind of the God's ways are not our ways. His ways are higher than ours. So we should just piously trust God to have it all in control. Or you could see it as saying, well, God's in heaven and we're down here. So there's a big gulf in between and God doesn't really want to be bothered with the stuff down here. I realize that can be a strange view for Christians to hear, especially coming from the Bible, but I think that does fit more closely with the perspective that Qoheleth would have. Let's continue with Uncut. The context of the entire book will have to be kept in mind as we answer these questions in the following commentary. One of the difficulties of this verse is the meaning of this phrase. Since he is encouraging listening and not an alternative to sacrifice, does this mean that all sacrifices are those of fools? Or is this a certain type of sacrifice that is foolish? If one thinks of Qoheleth as an orthodox wise man, a position that I have argued against in this commentary, that's Longman talking and I agree with his position on that, then one will have a specific notion of what a sacrifice of fools entails. It would be one offered in form only, the type of sacrifice inveighed against by the psalmist in Psalm 40, 7-9, and in the prophets like Micah 6:6. If he is less than fully orthodox, he would regard religious formalism as reprehensible. End quote. So Longman is trying to understand what does Qoheleth mean by saying that you should be more ready to hear than to give the sacrifice of fools. And in order to understand what he means, you kind of have to get at what is the sacrifice of fools. And that is going to depend on how you interpret the book as a whole. You see how this is all connected? This is why early on I said Ecclesiastes is kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure novel. You can really read this book from so many different angles, and the meaning changes every time. It's incredible the way that this book is constructed. I honestly believe it's purposeful. I think we're meant to be essentially tricked into meditating on this book, because the more you're frustratedly wrestling through what the heck did he mean, well, you're thinking about what he said. So he was a very effective wordsmith here. And so there's a couple options. If you think that he is more of an orthodox wisdom teacher, you might see him as speaking against a particular type of sacrifice, a sacrifice that is not the best that a person could give, maybe a half-hearted sacrifice, something like that. And you're going to define a sacrifice of fools that way. But if you think that he is speaking against the religious cult, he might be saying that all sacrifices are the sacrifices of fools. Only a fool would sacrifice to a God that they can't see, to a God that they don't even for sure know is there. The stuff that you are using to sacrifice, the offerings that you are giving, could be used for other things. So you are a fool to give to something that you are unsure whether or not it's actually accomplishing anything, when you could just use those resources for what you actually need. Now, as jarring as that second option is, I think it is more likely what Qoheleth was trying to communicate. If we could time travel him into today, I think it might be equivalent to his seeing someone who is struggling financially, and they are tithing to a church, hoping that God will reward them for their giving. And I think Qoheleth would look at that person and say, why are you sacrificing to this God when maybe he gave you that money to use to take care of your financial problems? I want to be clear, I am not against giving to a church if they are doing good with the funds. We're just trying to get in the mindset of Qoheleth and understand why he would seem so negatively bent against something that seems positive. It's important to remember that Qoheleth is not an atheist. He is not trying to get you to ditch your religion or your belief in God. I do think he is trying to get you to deconstruct it, though, because he sees these assumptions that we have about our God, our faith, our work, our relationships, and he thinks that they are holding us back from living the good life. So if he can chip away at that and get us to see cracks in our foundation, yes, it forces us to tear down. Yes, it forces us to rebuild. But better to rebuild on a corrected foundation than to have a nice elaborate building on a faulty foundation. That's his rationale, and it hurts, but I understand the wisdom behind this, and I actually appreciate his wanting to do this, as unorthodox as it feels. There also seems to be a hyperlink here to the story of King Saul and the time he fought against the Amalekites. God had told him through Samuel to kill everything, man, woman, child, animal. That's a whole nother issue for another day. But for our purposes today, Saul kept some of the animals alive. He also spared the king. Samuel doesn't like that. He comes to him and says, "Does God have as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying his voice? To obey is better than to sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams." The word for obey there is from the same root that is here in this verse when it says to be more ready to hear than to give sacrifices. The word in Hebrew, you probably already know it, it's Shema. Shema is one of the more popularly known Hebrew words because of its appearance in Deuteronomy 6, a passage that has come to be known as the Shema because it begins with the word Shema. And it says, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God is one God." And that translation of that verse is yet again a whole nother issue for another day. There's a lot going on in that verse. But the point is, this word Shema in Hebrew, it can mean to hear, it can mean to obey, and a handful of things in between those two. The concepts of hearing and obeying in Hebrew are very closely linked. They're not really separated the way that we separate them in English. It's assumed that if you are hearing something, if you are learning something, if you are understanding something, you are then expected to act on it. Once new information is understood, action is anticipated. So there is a debate amongst translators whether this should be, when you go into the temple, be ready to understand or be ready to obey. And really, either could work. Again, they're very closely related. It's almost better to say, when you enter the temple, be ready to hear and obey. And that would kind of get the full meaning of the word. The meaning of the end of this verse is a little difficult to ascertain. King James says, "For they consider not that they do evil." Robert Alter translated it, "For they do not even know how to do evil." And he says that this Hebrew is very enigmatic, and he added the word "even" in there for interpretive reasons. The sense would be that these people are so stupid they don't even have the consciousness of doing evil, let alone the mental clarity to do good. End of quote. Uncut points out that some scholars think there's actually a textual issue here where maybe a word is missing or has been mistranslated, and so it should be knowing nothing other than to do evil. And with that translation, the meaning is that these people are so stupid they are not even aware that their sacrifices are evil. So really, there's two different ways that you could look at this. It could either be saying that these fools who sacrifice are so stupid that they don't even know how to do evil. Like, they basically have the intelligence of a baby. Or it could be that they are so stupid they do not realize that what they are doing is evil. Either way, Qoheleth is taking shots at these people. Rami Shapiro, in the Ecclesiastes Annotated and Explained commentary, views Beit Ha-Elohim as referring to the whole world. That's the phrase, house of God. So rather than just limiting it to the temple, he says that the house of God is the entire world. And he says, if that is the case, drawing close and listening means that you should observe life carefully rather than lose your life in the sacrifice of fools, the sacrifice of happiness, friendship, and tranquility that comes when you give in to envy and endless toil. On the other hand, if Qoheleth is speaking of the temple in Jerusalem, he is criticizing the wealthy who enter the temple with great pomp, offering sacrifices not in service to God, but to flaunt their wealth and stature. End of quote. I don't think Qoheleth was intending us to see House of God as referring to the whole world, but I do appreciate the devotional notes that Shapiro added there. I think a verse like this kind of got turned into the modern day idea of don't talk in church, like keep quiet when you're in the church building. But really, the point of this silence is to find contemplative solace from the busyness of life. So saying keep your foot when you go into the house of God and be ready to listen isn't saying shut up and speak in quiet, hushed tones when you're in church. No, it's saying that you should be basically what James had of be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. It's that sort of thing. It's just saying if you are walking into a place where you are expecting to meet with God, be very careful how much you talk, because you have your entire week to yourself. If this is a place where you expect to meet God, shouldn't you be listening? It's kind of like if you got to see a celebrity once a week, but you just talked over them the whole time. You should be going there and listening to them because you only see them once a week. Personally, I think the people who need to hear this most are the preachers. And I say that as someone who was trained to be a preacher. I spent 5 years doing Bible college degrees. It's really easy for preachers to think that the people are coming there every week to hear them. I mean, who else gets a half hour to an hour and a half, depending on your church, just to talk and let people listen? Where else does that happen anymore today? Where else do you go and listen to someone else just talk their views at you with no interaction from you for at least a half hour, if not more? It's kind of a power trip for a lot of these people. They may not even realize it. And so you get these preachers droning on and on, sharing their views on God, when really they should be just as quiet in the presence of God as they expect everyone else to be in their sermons. I wonder how different church might be if we spent more time just sitting and contemplating than listening to a motivational speech. Or depending on the type of church you're in, it might be a demotivational speech. Qoheleth's point is that being in the presence of God is supposed to bring us solace from the busyness of our lives. We work 5 to 6 days a week, and we're supposed to have at least one day here where we get to pause from all of the busyness. And that was the origin of religious practices. Religion wasn't intended for you to be there for Sunday school, Sunday morning, and Sunday night. It was intended to give you a break from the busyness of the world. Basically a social gathering to get together with people, talk about your life. And because so much of life in the ancient world revolved around what you trusted a God to provide you, it just ended up being that you talked about this God. And as people wrote about it, you talked about their writings on it. And yet today it has turned into the exact opposite of this rest and solace. It's just created more busyness. It's like another day of work for so many people. That misses the point so much, and I don't think it pleases God. I don't think God looks down on the average American church and is happy with how busy they are for him, with how much they ask of their people to give. I think he's saying you're supposed to be a haven of rest. What have you turned into? I think even Jesus drew on Qoheleth's wisdom here in some of his teachings, like Matthew 5:34-35, when he says, "But I say to you, don't swear at all, neither by heaven, for it's God's throne, nor by earth, for it's his footstool, neither by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. But let your communication just be yes, yes, and no, no, because anything more than that comes from evil." Now, it's important to realize when he says not to swear at all, he doesn't mean 4-letter words there. I think a lot of people assume the Bible's talking about swear words when they hear swear or curse in the Bible, but that's not the point at all. Swearing in the Bible is taking an oath, and cursing is in the sense of, oh man, what could I compare it to today? I guess the closest thing in modern imagination for that is like a voodoo doll, when you are purposefully trying to curse another person to have bad luck or for the gods to be against them. In our more secularized culture, it just doesn't really fit our conceptions. But in the ancient world, when you believed that gods controlled the fate of humans, you could curse another human to have disfavor before the gods. You could be asking the gods to harm that person. So that's usually what cursing means in the Bible. Swearing has the idea of, I am speaking a vow to God. I am promising something. And this even seems to be drawing off of Deuteronomy 23:21 that reads, when you vow a vow to Yahweh your God, don't be slack to pay it. Don't hesitate to pay it. Don't be slow to pay off your debt. For Yahweh your God will certainly require it of you, and it would be a sin to you. In other words, if you promise God that if X happens, you'll do Y, X happens, you don't do Y, he is not going to be happy with you. This is a very transactional view of God, and I am purposefully putting it bluntly and almost a little crassly, because even though I think hearing me say it this way might upset some Christians, it's actually the view of God that they have in their minds. A lot of people have this transactional view of God that if I do X, Y, and Z, he has to bless me. Or if I am having a really rough time in life, it must be because I'm not doing enough for God. That is a transactional view of faith. I do X that God likes, he gives me favor. He blesses me. He makes sure my bills are paid and I have food on the table, or I get that job promotion, or he sends me the perfect boyfriend, girlfriend, what have you. I don't do those things and life is just not going to go my way. As crass as that sounds, that really is the view that many of us have. And this is the view that Qoheleth has, because that's mostly an ancient view. I would argue that a good bit of the Bible actually goes against this transactional view of faith. And that's a whole nother issue for another day, but I don't think that we have to view God essentially as a vending machine. If you click the right buttons, he'll deliver you exactly what you want. That's not a healthy way to view God, and it's setting yourself up for disappointment. That's another conversation for another day, which I think I'm on my third time now, so we're going to need a bingo card for when I have to say something like that in an episode. Man, I could be 80 and still have way too much content to record for this podcast. You never run out of interesting things to talk about when you talk about the Bible. Let's get into what Uncut says about this. We're in verse 2 now, and Longman says, the topic of this verse and the next is clearly prayer. This is, don't be rash with your mouth. Don't hastily utter anything before God. On the one hand, a pious Qoheleth could be warning his readers not to badger God with superfluous talk. After all, God's in heaven. That is, he is in control. This approach considers Qoheleth's warning as an anticipation of Matthew 6, 7 to 8. And when you pray, don't keep on babbling words. Don't be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Qoheleth, however, hasn't been anything but pious up to this point. His damper on prayer stands over against the torrent of the psalmist's heartfelt words, in that Qoheleth advises people to approach God in prayer only rarely, and then only briefly, as if the danger is taking too much of God's precious time. Qoheleth warns his readers to be cautious in approaching God with words, because God is in heaven, you are on earth. We take this statement not as an assertion of divine power, but of divine distance, perhaps even of indifference. End of quote. And again, this is probably going to shock some of our Christian listeners here, but Qoheleth is actually saying, don't pray so much. Pray less, make it less about the quantity and more about the quality. And in order to understand why he's thinking this way, we have to consider what these sacrifices would have meant in the ancient world. You couldn't just sacrifice anywhere. You were expected to do it in a specific location where heaven and earth met. In this particular instance, it would be the temple. The temple was like a picture of Eden. So a sacrifice was a way to try to remind us of what happened in Eden, try to get us a little bit closer to getting back there. And you brought an offering because you were going to be asking something of the God. So it would be like going over to someone's house for dinner, right? You're expected to bring flowers or a dessert or wine or what have you. Or really, I guess it would be even more like if you were going to your boss and you wanted to ask for a raise, and so you bring donuts into the office that day and make sure you stop by their office first. It's basically a bribe. The offering, the sacrifice, this vow that he's talking about, it is a bribe, saying, God, I want your attention. You have power, you have ability to accomplish something in my life that I am having difficulty with. If you help me out with this, I will give you this in return. And Qoheleth is basically saying, don't waste time on this. If you feel that you have to do this, be as short and sweet about it as possible because you don't want to tick off God by wasting his time. That sounds very different than the traditional Christian idea of prayer, where we're supposed to be talking to God at all times. What was in one of the Thessalonians, I believe, right? With pray without ceasing. And yet, I don't think Qoheleth's view is as far removed from the rest of the Bible as we might think. Now, it is quite far removed from the way that we think about it, but perhaps it is our idea that needs to change. This is something that's been bugging me for quite a while now, ever since I was studying the passage in 2 Corinthians 12, where Paul talks about the thorn in the flesh that he had. This is a popular New Testament passage, and scholars like to debate over what exactly Paul's thorn in the flesh was. Here we go again. Another issue for another day, because that is a very, very fascinating passage and can absolutely be its own episode. I think Dr. Heiser in his Naked Bible podcast covered that once or twice in pretty good detail. So I'll just direct you to that if you have interest in it for the time being. But what's relevant for our topic here today is that Paul was talking about whatever that thorn in the flesh was. A massive, life-changing difficulty, an obstacle that was completely insurmountable. It was causing a lot of anxiety and problems for him. And so he prays for God to remove it. In fact, he says, I prayed 3 times that God would remove it. And we're supposed to be reading that as, wow, I can't believe how seriously he took this. Did you catch it, though? He only prayed 3 times that God would remove it. If I had a big decision coming up in my life, and I went to any pastor and said, you know, I have been thinking about doing this, and I have prayed about it 3 times, they would all look at me like I'm crazy and say, well, you need to pray harder, son. Pray more. You can't just stop at 3. What do you think you're doing? And yet Paul presented his 3 petitions for this thorn in the flesh to be removed as if it was an extreme form of prayer, that he didn't give up the first time or the second time, but even went a 3rd time before he accepted no for an answer. And the circles I grew up in, it was common to have a prayer list. This would be for people or just general requests that you had that you would just pray every day or every week for God to answer. In fact, we had entire prayer meetings in the middle of the week where we would go through a sheet of paper, pray for this person to be saved, pray for that person to be healed from this surgery, pray for this person to get a job, or that person to get a new car, whatever it might be. And we would just pray over and over for these, and particularly in the salvation and health categories, the names didn't change much. They usually stayed on there until basically the person died, or a new pastor came in and decided to revamp the list, in which case it just happened again in 2 years. That is not the picture of prayer in the Bible. In fact, I think if Paul or Qoheleth or any of the biblical writers could enter into one of those midweek prayer meetings, they might be okay with it the first week. They might even be okay with it the second week and think that we're just really pious. But by the time they start hearing us do this 3, 4, 5, dozens of times, they're going to go, what are you doing? Why are you still praying for these things? You already asked God for them. Do you have so little faith that he hasn't heard you, that you think you have to keep repeating it? It's like we're little children yelling out "Mom" until our mom pays attention to us.
Ma! Mom! 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 Mommy! Mommy! Mama! Mama!
Biblical prayer isn't talking God into submission until you wear him down with your requests. I think some Christians have the idea of that from Jesus' one parable about the unjust judge and the woman who keeps bugging him about her request, and they transport that onto God, forgetting that the judge is an unjust judge. Jesus' whole point is, you might have to do that with a physical ruler, you don't have to do that with God. We should be presenting our prayer requests before God, and then going on with our daily lives, doing what we can to get the results that we want, and trusting that God has heard and will help us in our endeavors. Once you ask God for something, you don't have to keep bugging him for it. He heard you the first time, and he's working on it. And he expects you to be working on it in the meantime as well. That's a very different idea of prayer than what you'll hear in most churches or Christian books or podcasts, but it's much closer to the biblical ideal. Moving into verse 3, we get into some verses that are really difficult to understand and translate. We're talking about a lot of dreams and a lot of words. For a dream comes through the multitude of busyness, and a fool's voice is known by the multitude of words. And yes, I know technically the word in the King James there is business, but the idea of it is busyness with your work. Robert Alter says, in this context, the phrase seems to refer to the confusion of ideas and images characteristic of dreams, which are said to resemble a fool's chatter. The talk of the fool would include the rash vows that the fool has no intention to fill. End of quote. I think we can all relate to having wacky dreams that make about as much sense as listening to an idiot talk. And that is one possible interpretation of this verse. The Good News Bible, though, translates it in the most understandable way that I have found so far. It says, the more you worry, the more likely you are to have bad dreams. And the more you talk, the more likely you are to say something foolish. That really helps me to understand the connection between those two parts, because the multitude of dreams doesn't always seem to match what he's talking about with the multitude of words from a fool. But this kind of helps us to connect it if we read it the way the Good News Bible had it. The more you worry, the more likely you are to have bad dreams. The more you talk, the more likely you are to say something foolish. This is a little bit of a lengthy quote from Uncut, but it helps to dig into some of the issues here. Qoheleth bolsters his commands of the previous verse with an analogy. As argued below, we cannot be certain about the exact nature of the comparison. Work leads to many dreams, foolishness leads to many words. Perhaps, though, the idea is that hard work so tires a person that one starts losing touch with reality. The analogy may suggest that those who are foolish as to think their many words have any appreciable effect on God are also living in a fantasy world. I should take a second and just let that sink in. Going back to those midweek prayer services we would have growing up, we would actually have times where, like, the pastor would get up and say, here's the stuff to pray for, and then everybody gets together in groups, usually just 2 or 3 people, sometimes a few more, and they would just pray in rounds for these people. And I'm sorry, I am very easily distractible. It was always hard for me to try to pray when I heard 50 to 100 other voices all around me doing the exact same thing. It was just so easy to get caught up in that. I'm too easily distracted. And I know I am not alone in this. If you have ever sat through a prayer meeting and listened more to other people's prayers than praying your own, please drop us a comment and let me know I am not alone here. And if that is the case, tell me some of the strangest things you have ever heard in a prayer meeting, because I can tell you I heard some weird ones. It's like people would blather on knowing that God was a captive audience and he had to listen to whatever they said, so they just let it all out. No joke, I literally once heard someone just quote words to a Christmas song to God. And no, it was not a Christian Christmas song. It was literally Baby It's Cold Outside in the middle of a prayer meeting. Yep, that happened. I think Qoheleth is talking to people like that and saying, if you're talking to God, you don't want to waste your words. You would do better to say what you need to say and then shut up and listen the rest of the prayer meeting. Now, in the rest of this quote from Uncut, Longman uses the technical terms colon and cola. And in this context, a colon is not a punctuation mark and cola is not a beverage. A colon is a clause that requires another clause to complete the thought. So a single clause in a verse is called a colon. Put together, more than one colon is called a cola. So cola is the plural of colon, which, by the way, is not how you pronounce my name. Thank you, Colin Powell, for ruining that for me for my whole life. Going back to Uncut, on the surface, the content of the two cola is not obviously related, so part A and part B of verse 3. The first colon makes the observation that dreams often accompany the preoccupation of overwork. Some scholars make a connection with the second part of the verse and the context by citing the supposed function of the cult prophet. Remember what we said about cult earlier. who, upon getting a request from a worshipper, would then expect to receive a dream revelation from God. According to these interpreters, Qoheleth objects to this practice because he doesn't believe that such divine communications are possible. While the practices are well known in other parts of the ancient Near East, they are not clearly attested as a normal part of Israelite worship, though God does occasionally speak through dreams during the time of the Old Testament. And I'd like to add to that God speaks in the New Testament through dreams as well, like with Joseph around the time of the birth of Jesus. So I think there could be something to what Longman is suggesting there, that Qoheleth might be specifically speaking against dream interpreters that would try to say God has a message for you for this. Now, this was not common in my circles of Christianity that I grew up in, but if you come from maybe a more charismatic background, this might be something that you have experienced, where you have somebody come to you and say, I have a dream interpretation for you, or if you mention a dream, they try to interpret for you, or say, here's a message from God for you. Qoheleth is calling that hevel, foolishness. And I realize that's an important part of faith to some people and what they think they can communicate with God. But Qoheleth seems to be quite the skeptic when it comes to that area. Uncut continues, if there is a close connection between the first colon and the second colon, it escapes the modern reader. Above, I speculated that the point is, as hard work causes one to lose touch with reality, so the words produced by fools are also a mere fantasy. But this is nothing more than a guess. In any case, the second part of the verse is the punchline that has an obvious connection with the context. The first colon serves its purpose by citing an analogy that has unpleasant associations. To paraphrase, as one can expect dreams, or uneasy sleep, during the preoccupation that accompanies heavy work, so one can expect to find a fool behind a loquacious speaker. Thus, while the exact impact of the proverb escapes us, and may never have even been present in the first instance, the point is clearly drawn. Only a fool prays a lot. End of quote. In verse 4, Qoheleth specifically starts targeting vows. When you vow a vow to God, don't hesitate to pay it, because he doesn't have any pleasure in fools. Vows are a very interesting topic that we could really spend a while on, but put crassly, they were a way of manipulating God. God, if I promise to do X for you, you have to do Y for me. And it was expected that both parties would have to keep up their end of the bargain. And this does happen throughout the Bible. There are instances of people making vows and then fulfilling them. Even vows of child sacrifice, such as 2 Kings 3:27 with King Mesha, and even with Jephthah and his daughter in Judges 11. Those are very awkward, weird, uncomfortable passages where a man vows the life of another person for God's favor. And in both of those cases, they appear to get it. Whether or not their victory in battle actually came about because of their vow of sacrificing another human, or if that's just what they perceived, that is a whole other matter, but that does seem to be what the biblical authors thought, that these vows, even ones as serious as sacrificing their own child, were valid before God. But then you also have some instances in the Bible where vows are made and then go broken, and it's totally okay. There's no punishment for it. Judges 17, you have the issue of a woman who has some valuables stolen, and she curses them, basically making a vow regarding those goods. But then when she finds out it's her son that stole them from her, she doesn't actually fulfill the vow. She doesn't continue with the curse. She just lets things be, and nothing bad happens. In 1 Samuel, Saul curses whoever eats during the battle. And when he finds out that his son Jonathan did it, he was actually going to continue through with his vow because he feared God, like this position that Qoheleth has. But the men of his army liked his son Jonathan too much. He was one of their generals, basically. And so they convinced Saul not to go through with his vow. And nothing happens. So you kind of get dual presentations of this throughout the Bible, where sometimes keeping a vow does actually allow for good things to happen, no matter how problematic that vow may have been. But But then you have other stories where vows are made and broken and nothing happens. So what exactly you think of vows and how God views them and if they actually accomplish anything is kind of a matter of debate and more than we can get into here. But it is a topic I want to at least bring up and start the discussion on. So I'd be curious to hear more of your thoughts on this. I think really what Qoheleth is trying to say is, why bug God for these things that you want if everything is just going to pass away soon enough anyway? Why are you bugging God for your wish list if you only have a couple decades left to enjoy it at most? In fact, in the next verse, he says it's better not to vow at all than to vow and not be able to keep your vow. Vows were never actually commanded anywhere in the Bible. Nowhere in the Old Testament law, the Torah, there is no command to vow a vow to God. So since that's the case, Qoheleth is saying, why are you doing this? God never said, vow to me. So why are you putting yourself in harm's way? Why are you playing a dangerous game with a capricious God if he didn't say this is the way it should be done? Now, sacrifices and vows were a big part of ancient Israelite religion. So Qoheleth is kind of taking a minority view here and is a little dissident in comparison to the rest of the religious system of his day. The Interpretation Bible Commentary points out that he's not alone within the Bible, though. Psalm 50 also exposes the inadequacy of sacrifice from God's perspective, since, quote, "the world and all that is in it is mine." God, therefore, has no physical need for slaughtered animals. Consequently, the psalmist commends only those sacrifices that are offered in thanksgiving and the payment of vows, activities also enjoined, not coincidentally, by Qoheleth. More broadly, the preference for right conduct over sacrifice is attested frequently in the biblical tradition. This is what we talked about in 1 Samuel 15. It's also in Proverbs 21:3, Isaiah 1:12-17, Hosea 6:6, Amos 5:21-24, and Micah 6:6-8, to name a few. In verse 6, your mouth causing your flesh to sin is basically making a vow that you do not then keep. So with your mouth you made the vow, but then in your body you sin by not fulfilling the vow, not paying back to God what you promised him. Now, the King James says to not say before the angel that it was an error. Depending on what version you read, you're going to get different words there. In fact, the NAB says his representative, NIV says the temple messenger, RSV, NRSV, NASB, MLB, NJ, PS, they all say the messenger. ASV and Douay-Rheims also say angel, like the King James. NEB says angel of God. So what's going on here? Well, the Hebrew word is malak, and malak can mean messenger, or it can mean angel. That's where we get the idea that angels are messengers. And it really just depends on the context. Is this talking about a human messenger bringing a message, or is this talking about a supernatural courier? Without getting too deep into it, it's also worth noting that sometimes this word will be translated as God. That's because, as we've talked about before in the podcast, the Hebrew word for God, Elohim, it's not a name, it's a title, or really it's more of a class. Anything that did not have a physical body, something that was a supernatural entity, was a god. It was a part of the class of Elohim. Angels are included in that. And so as time goes on in Israelite religion, and they become more careful about when they talk about God or use his name, and they start to have more of a dualistic God versus the devil sort of mindset, they take some of these references to other gods and sometimes even angels, and they just flatten them out. So sometimes the references to other gods become angels, sometimes the reference to angels become God, and it's just trying to smooth out the theology, make it easier. But at its core, this word malak can mean messenger or angel. So you have some translators who think that there is actually an angel that is watching over the vows that humans make. And that is an older rabbinic tradition as well. But then you have some who think that this is a human messenger, basically a temple official who would be sent out to collect on the vow, if you will. Check in on the person. Like, you were expected to make this vow in the temple. To make it official, maybe you say it before a priest. And so then they send the messenger from the temple to your house, make sure, hey, did this actually come about? You owe God now. So those are two different options, different translations, and scholars are going to differ on that. I'm not sure which way I would lean on this one. Qoheleth doesn't seem to have a very developed idea of the supernatural realm, so I think it could very well just be a temple messenger, but I would not necessarily write off the idea of his believing there was an angel either. Shapiro believes that Qoheleth avoids anthropomorphism in his writing, so he thinks that Qoheleth is not referring to an angry and vindictive God in this verse when he says, "Why should God be angry at your voice?" Rather, he thinks that this is invoking the God's wrath means setting in motion events that can only lead to your own destruction. That's a little bit of a reworking of the text there. I'm not 100% sure that's what Qoheleth would have intended, but I do think that he's getting at the actual heart of the matter here. We get so worried about God being mad at us, when really what's happening is our own anxiety over all of this is setting in motion our own destruction of our plans, our goals, our hopes that we have tried so hard to achieve. Uncut has an insightful observation that a key word here is error. When he says, don't say before the angel or God or the messenger, or however you want to translate it, that it was an error. This is the Hebrew word shegaga. Shegaga. Isn't Hebrew fun?
Shakaka! Shakasha! Ah! Shish kebab. Shawshank Redemption. Chicago!
Shegaga is specifically a sin that has been committed in ignorance. It is not done intentionally. So the point of this verse is, if you are intentionally trying to cheat God by making a promise that you have no intention of fulfilling, don't try to pretend that it was actually a mistake on your part, because he's going to see through that. And then Longman goes on to say, since the sin will be judged as an intentional one, it will bring on God's wrath and result in the destruction of the person's work. Notice that Qoheleth says God will destroy the work of your hands. It must be remembered that this is an area of work that Qoheleth has hope of joy in this present life, so its destruction is therefore disastrous. End of quote. I really appreciate that they point out that this is intentionally trying to game God by claiming that you didn't actually mean what you said. Because this injunction on vows can be very spiritually abusive if mishandled. And it was mishandled in the tradition that I was growing up in. Growing up, I heard something like this used basically to guilt you into making sure that you gave more to God. And they missed the first part of this. Teachers would press you to commit things to God, and then they would guilt you with saying, well, make sure that you don't actually go back on your vow to God. Make sure that you keep it. So they missed the whole first part where Qoheleth says, because vows are so serious, you probably shouldn't be doing them at all. And this wasn't just taught to adults. I'm talking about children and teenagers specifically. I have known plenty of good Christian teenagers who were seen as struggling with some sort of sin. Maybe it's being disrespectful to parents, or often it was pornography or a relationship or something like that. And they would make a vow to God at camp or a revival service or something that they would give up whatever sin that they were struggling with, not realizing that it was a habit that they had formed. And we were never taught that sometimes you have to wean off of things. We were just expected to go cold turkey if you felt that you were supposed to make a change in your life, and you're supposed to trust God to make up for the difference for you. That's not how it works. So we would agonize over this when we inevitably go back to these things that we're trying to get out of our lives. And sometimes it wasn't even necessarily sinful things or wrong things. It was just stuff that we felt guilty over because of the culture that we were raised in. And because we wanted to be good Christian young people, we would try to give up this. We would promise God, hoping that the severity of taking a vow before God would actually help us to overcome our horrible sins at this time. And then we'd be so scared and frustrated when we inevitably went back to it, and we felt like we went back on this vow to God. I wish someone would be able to go back in time and tell younger me and people I knew who were in the same situation what Qoheleth was actually saying here, and to say, you don't ever have to make a promise to God. And this is talking about promises that you intentionally did not ever plan on keeping. Trying to double cross God, having your fingers crossed behind your back when you pray or make a promise to God. See, that wasn't the mindset that we ever had back then. We weren't trying to game God. We were seriously trying to follow God and the people that we thought were following him that were over us in these ministries. So let me just say, if you were anything like me or the people I knew growing up that were in a situation like this, God was not mad at you for making a promise that you could not keep. That's not what these verses are talking about. This isn't saying you promised God to give up some habit in your life and then you went back on it and now he's going to strike you with lightning for it. No, this is talking about somebody who very intentionally is trying to trick God into doing something for them, hoping to get away without having to keep their end of the bargain. That's not the attitude of any Christian I've ever known. So let's stop using this as a text of terror, especially weaponized against young people who are impressionable and trusting us to present God's word to them faithfully. Do not cause religious trauma on people by using these verses as a weapon. Let's remember what Qoheleth is actually saying, and if anything, push people away from that kind of religious fanaticism. Verse 7 sounds very similar to verse 3, but it takes a slightly different spin. For in the multitude of dreams and many words, there is also vanity, hevel, but you fear God. The idea of all of this seems to be that life doesn't really make sense with or without God. But if there is some being that exists outside of our reality and acts as judge over it, then at least you have a little hope of things being evened out that didn't work out in this life. So I think Qoheleth is kind of taking a pragmatic view in order to help yourself sleep better at night, while also being practical enough to acknowledge that you have to be the one to make a difference in your own life. Bible Project reminds us that Qoheleth is not trying to make us atheists, but rather humble theists. Brown in the Ecclesiastes interpretation Bible commentary says, for every dream there is a multitude of interpretations, as any psychologist can attest. As meaningless blather characterizes the fool's discourse, so dreams can be accompanied by much needless preoccupation. Yet it is all for naught. Dreams are nothing more than the unchecked imaginings of the unconscious. Consequently, nothing good can come from them, any more than wisdom can be culled from the nonsense of fools. Although dreams may seem terrifying or alluringly real, they're wholly vacuous fabrications, according to the sage who has seen everything. They are vanities, no more useful than senseless speech. Like prophetic utterances of the future, dreams may suggest that something new is at hand, but as the sage has repeatedly stated, there is nothing new under the sun. Divine reverence, or fear of God, as Qoheleth puts it, by contrast, is entirely real and eminently edifying, for it constitutes the compulsive moral force behind the fulfillment of duty and the driving rationale behind discriminating, thoughtful speech. End of quote. Put into simple terms, we don't know what, if anything, comes after this life. But if you believe that there is a God that judges everything, at least you have some rationale for being careful in what you say and do. Now, I don't entirely agree with that logic. I think it is possible for people to be moral beings without being Christians or believing in a God at all. I mean, all you have to do is actually look around you and realize that the majority of the world's population is not Christian, and yet there are plenty of people out there who do good and don't hurt other people. You do not need Christian morals in order to be a moral person. That is not an attack on Christian morals or to say that we should all be relativists, but it is saying that it is possible to be a good moral person apart from one particular belief system. But many people do see a belief in God as the driving force behind their actions for good or for evil. And that's okay. I guess it's just the therapy background I have that I don't like the idea of doing good just because you're afraid that some cosmic being is looking over your shoulder watching you. I don't think that is entirely healthy, but I also have to acknowledge that Qoheleth was not informed of modern psychology, and he doesn't have to be. He has plenty of wisdom for us without that, and that's not to say that modern psychology has arrived, but it is worth noting that people's views of God develop over time, and the ancients seem to have this more be afraid of God. Like, actually, fear of God means to be terrified of this God who can ruin your life if you tick him off. And then even as the Bible progresses, we see a little bit of a change in perspective within the Bible itself of how we should approach God. I mean, that's kind of the whole idea of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross when you have the temple veil ripped in two, is that we don't need a mediator. We don't have to be so cautious and anxious about approaching God. So there are different ways of viewing this. I'm not necessarily advocating what Qoheleth is saying here. Rather, I'm just letting him carry out his thought experiment. He is taking our religious beliefs that we take for granted to the extreme. He's following them out to their logical conclusion. A lot of times we just stop where we're comfortable. And he says, well, have you actually thought about what your beliefs lead to if unchecked? And so he drives it all the way out to get us to rethink our very foundation of faith. Again, growing up, my tradition was never heavy on dreams. It was usually something that was written off. But I have known some very good Christian people, usually women, but sometimes men as well, who would have dreams of one sort or another and be anxious over what their meaning would be. This has been everything from, just weird things happening in a dream, which we all have happen, and they're trying to discern, well, what is the meaning for this? Is this trying to say something is about to happen in my life? Or I've even known some people who had dreams that included them doing things they would not be comfortable doing in real life, and they were worried that God might be upset at them for basically sinning in their dreams. I appreciate the sensitivity that people like this have, but I think Qoheleth would look at them and say, why are you so worried about this? Reality itself is Hevel, and you're dealing with stuff that isn't even reality. Why are we putting stock into something that we have absolutely no idea how reliable it might be? Now, before I say this next part, I want to make very clear, I am not in any way an expert on dreams, their interpretation, what they are. I am not a licensed psychologist to dissect any of these sorts of things, but I have come across an explanation of dreams written by people who understand these things better than I do and study them out a lot more than I do, where dreams are seen as essentially the way that your brain works through things that it didn't get to do when you were conscious. That's why sometimes what you watched on TV right before you go to bed shows up in the dream, or something you've been worrying about for the last week shows up in the dream. Now, obviously, that's not always the way it works. Sometimes stuff you haven't been thinking about shows up in a dream. But a lot of times it's things that have been recently in your mind. And so dreams, at least in this way of viewing it, again, I'm not an expert, but this makes sense to me and it has helped some other people. So this is the framework I view dreams through. They're like the recycle bin of the computer of your brain. You can only process so much in a day's time. And there are things that maybe you just didn't get time to think through all the way. Maybe you thought through them all the way and your brain goes, nope, we actually still have some processing to do. Or maybe it's something you've been avoiding thinking about. And so it comes up in your dreams because your brain is essentially trying to reset in time for tomorrow. And so it's doing a deep cleaning and saying, in order to have a healthy whole day tomorrow, we have to process this. We have to get this out of the way. So let's think about it now so we don't have to think about it tomorrow. But then what so many of us do is the dream freaks us out, and so we think about it all day tomorrow, and we kind of undo what the brain was trying to do with that. Now, that is a major oversimplification. Again, I am not an expert in this, and there are other theories and ideas of what exactly dreams do. We don't know for sure, but there are ideas that have been presented. And that one just makes sense to me. And I think it kind of fits what Qoheleth is saying here too. Now, obviously, he did not have that modern understanding psychologically of what dreams do, but he's essentially saying, don't put stock into them. Don't stay up all day worrying about that concerning dream you had. last night. If you dream about something that is upsetting or frustrating or just plain weird and confusing, that's just the nature of dreams. There is no greater meaning to it other than your brain was trying to process something it didn't think you got a chance to during the day. So you are not responsible for the things that you do in a dream any more than the things that happen to you in a dream actually happened to you. So don't read into them too much and don't put too much stock into it. It's not saying, you have to try to purposefully forget your dreams or totally ignore them, but just don't put too much stock into them. I think that's a healthy way to move forward. Uncut says, perhaps the point of comparison is fantasy. Dreams are out of touch with reality, and so, argues Qoheleth, are many words in a cultic setting. Qoheleth encourages his hearers away from a familiarity with God and toward a relationship characterized by fear. Though all of the words of this verse are well attested, the syntax renders it impossible to translate the verse with certainty. He is quite accurate there. Many opt to amend the text. He gives Michael Fox's translation, which is, for a lot of talk is like a lot of dreams and absurdities. Rather, fear God. But then a different translator has it as, with an abundance of words comes dreams and vanity in abundance. You, however, heed God. Basically, we don't fully know how to translate this verse. It does not work well in English or Hebrew. But the point at the end of it seems to be, and Uncut quotes, only a fool would speak a lot in the cult, end quote. All right, we are going to stop there for this week because this has already been quite a bit to cover today, and I think we've given enough to think about for the rest of the week. And the rest of this chapter starts going into politics and money. And then chapter 6, the majority of it, like 2/3, just carries on those comments about money and the value of wealth and even saving for retirement. It's really fascinating stuff, but I want to give it the proper attention that it deserves. So next week we will finish out chapter 5, possibly even get into chapter 6 there. And then we have some really fun stuff coming up here soon too. We are going to have a crossover episode with one of my favorite podcasts, and that is A Pastor and a Philosopher Walk into a Bar. As a great podcast, you have exactly what it says it is. You have a pastor and you have a philosopher, and they just have these deep Bible, theology, philosophy related conversations as if they were sitting in the back corner of a pub. They are a lot of fun to listen to. They come from very different perspectives, and yet they still dialogue with a lot of respect, and they were just as much fun to talk to. I cannot wait to release that episode. We've been sitting on that one for a little while now. We actually recorded that one a bit ago, so I can't wait to get that one out. That'll be coming out in a couple weeks here, and then we'll be doing a couple Q&R episodes, so be sure to send in your questions that you have about this series or anything else that we've talked about or that you would like addressed in this series, and we will do our best to cover those. So until next week, stay curious and keep asking questions about the Uncut and Unfiltered Bible. You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.